Our colloquium for this Cogtuito Hot Takes Part 1. We have actually co-authors, Christopher Phillips and Amber Griffioon. Ah, yes, awesome, amazing. And Christopher is a professor of philosophy at Southern Utah University, and Amber she's currently in Germany, but she will be at Notre Dame soon, right? Doing all sorts of fantastic things. And this presentation is a version of a forthcoming publication that they have, which is very exciting, alongside some other philosophy Twitter folks, as I understand it. So give it up for Amber and Chris.
Great, thank you so much. I'll share my screen here and then get things set up a little bit. Just like to say a couple of things. First, thank you very much for the opportunity to present this paper. It's been a long time in the making, and I'll preface it by saying that even though I've been thinking about this for a very long time, it's been made exponentially better by working with Amber. And so I'm really, really excited to be able to share this with all of you, and especially also with Amber. So what we're going to do is we'll start off and just do kind of a little introduction, cover some of the basics. We'll talk about Descartes' intellectual and theological context.
That happened.
At which point I will turn it over to Amber, who will take over and do all of the really interesting things, I think, in this paper, kind of showing us why we've all been reading Descartes' Meditations incorrectly for such a long time. So one other quick, I think, terminological note. In the abstract in a tweet, I characteristically started off by kind of attacking the idea that Descartes is a rationalist. And I should just note that what I don't mean is that placing him in some sort of mystical context means that he's an irrationalist or that he's engaged in something that is opposed to rational thought, but rather it's a challenge to the sort of more narrow reading of Descartes as sort of the kind of guy who's going to a priori his way to an entire universe or something along those lines. So that's just a quick note there. We can, of course, return back to that in the Q&A later. So let's get started. In recent years, Descartes' reputation as representing a decidedly singular voice against medieval scholasticism has come under some much needed scrutiny. Much of the scholarship challenging this understanding of Descartes as the quote unquote father of modern philosophy draws parallels between his thinking and that of late medieval thinkers such as Suarez, Eustachius, and Teresa of Avila, to name a few. We argue, however, that Descartes' thought did not emerge ex nihilo, nor was he single-handedly responsible for transforming the philosophy of 17th century Europe. Such a story gives him too much credit at the cost of ignoring other contributions and the complex intellectual, theological, and political context in which Descartes was located. In this paper, we argue that to adequately capture the complicated relationship between Descartes' work and late medieval thought, philosophers in general need to think not only about his ideas, but also about his presentation and choice of genre. Reading the Meditations as a mere discursive treatise containing a progressive and consistent set of arguments intended to establish a particular position fails to appreciate the eponymous genre that Descartes explicitly chose to employ in writing them. Instead, we argue that reading the text in light of the long tradition of contemplative meditative literature opens up a radically new way of interpreting the Meditations as a mystagogical project of spiritual edification and epistemic and volitional transformation. During such a transformation, the meditator undergoes a series of revelatory experiences structurally similar to those we find in so-called mystical, or what we will hear, or from here on out, refer to as mystagogical literature. And we'll discuss that in more detail a little bit later on. Section 2 of the text We motivate the view that Descartes himself was both familiar with the relevant contemplative mystagogical traditions in Catholic theology and had good reason to think it would be rhetorically effective in bringing philosophers and theologians to accept his broader project. We argue that Descartes' historical and intellectual development can be traced through Cardinal Pierre de Bérulle and his influences, including the Acari group, the Oratorians, St. Bonaventure, Benet of Canfield, and Pseudo-Dionysius, among others, illustrating historical connections and tracing their doctrinal influences to Descartes' own writing. Ultimately, we believe the commentators who have focused on connections to specific works aren't thinking big enough. Rather, following Amelie Rorty, and shout out to David Cunning, thanks for being here, we argue that the Meditations is a text that draws from a broad swath of intellectual, philosophical, and theological traditions. That is, his use of genre is not limited to figures such as St. Francis, Teresa, or Augustine, but rather borrows tropes and structural elements common to various traditions in early modern Europe that would later become described as mystical. In section 3, we illustrate some of the similarities between the Meditations and particular trends commonly found in mystagogical literature. Similarly, we'll point to the structural parallels between the phases of transformation stressed in much of the mystagogical literature and their instantiations in the Meditations. Further, we'll explore a few common tropes employed in the service of mystagogical transformation that find interesting parallels in the Cartesian meditative project. While some of these structural and tropological comparisons have already been touched upon by other scholars, their transformational significance has not yet been sufficiently explored. We show how paying attention to these mystagogical aspects of the Meditations can open up new avenues for understanding the connection between theoretical, practical, and theological aspects of Descartes' own thought. Such a reading will also resolve a number of seemingly glaring problems and peculiarities in the Meditations, including the Cartesian circle and the tension of the Cartesian notion of the will. We also argue that the odd detours the meditator takes in the sixth meditation through physiology are not mere digressions, but rather mark an often overlooked aspect of the mystagogical story, namely the return to embodiment as a transformed self. Indeed, the overly intellectual emphasis of contemporary scholars on the contemplative aspects of, Indeed, the overly intellectual emphasis of contemporary scholars on both the contemplative aspects of mystagogical literature and the epistemological focus of Descartes' project in the Meditations have caused them to largely overlook the ways in which the aim of both medieval and Cartesian meditation involves a transformative reorientation of the whole person and their understanding of the world, one which has practical, moral, and social consequences that have gone underexplored in the discussion of these texts. If we're correct in our rereading of the Meditations, then the sort of transformative experience Descartes' meditator undergoes is much more comprehensive than the traditional rationalist interpretation would lead us to believe. And again, that's rationalist in the sort of narrow sense. So let's turn our attention to the intellectual and theological context. There are two major events that occurred early in Descartes' intellectual career, which are both widely known and underemphasized in much of the philosophical literature concerning Descartes' writing. The first is the largely recounted, but often overly rationalized or straightforwardly ignored series of dreams Descartes claims to have experienced while in a state of ecstasy in 1619. The second is the Salon, where Descartes, on the prodding of Cardinal Bérulle, criticized an alchemist named Chandos for offering a merely probabilistic form of science as a replacement for the Aristotelian paradigm. Despite how widely known both of these events are, scholars have, by and large, developed a narrative surrounding Descartes that seeks to divorce him from his intellectual and theological context. It's easy enough to read a scientific, narrowly scientific focus into the later vignette and to attempt to divorce the metaphysical or epistemological issues from the theological worries of the period, but it's somewhat more difficult with Descartes' dreams. Still, scholars have not shied away from downplaying or overly rationalizing the dreams, seemingly in order to maintain a consistent picture of Descartes as a kind of narrowly described rationalist. Despite the developments in the natural sciences in the 17th century, intellectual life in Europe was decidedly less narrowly rationalist than traditional philosophical narratives would have us believe. Suggestions of demonic possession were fairly common, and at the turn of the 17th century, public exorcisms drew substantial public attention. That Descartes had 3 dreams which he himself described as involving divine inspiration is not disputed. What we should do with that information, however, is a much livelier topic. We're not going to spend time here recounting the details of the specific dreams. Instead, we'll note a few salient features of the dreams that Descartes and of Descartes' own reflections on his thinking at the time, with an eye toward building a case that Descartes was at least open to mystical experience. Of the dreams, Alice Brown writes that Baillet provides an account of Descartes' state of mind at the time. She says, quote, "He had not been drinking, and he had been in a state of enthusiasm for some days. Descartes then went to bed on the evening of the 10th of November, 1619, having made a discovery which seemed very important to him and expecting dream revelation," end quote. I think there are 2 important notes to be drawn from this passage. The first is that Descartes was expecting revelation, which he subsequently claimed to get. The second is that he considered himself in a state of enthusiasm, which in the 17th century was almost entirely relegated to religious experiences and not seldomly associated with what we would later call mystical experience. Whatever we make of Descartes' own account of these dreams, it's clear that he was, at least at this early stage of his intellectual development, steeped in a context where the idea of prophetic dreams and divine inspiration was not out of the ordinary. The dreams themselves are pretty wild, and specific aspects of them seem to recur later on throughout Descartes' writing. In one of the dreams, Descartes claims to have been visited by an evil genius, which should sound familiar. This, in the dream, of course, was a little bit different. It caused him physical pain rather than epistemic pain, if we want to call it that. It's still striking that the phrasing is so similar, however. In the first dream, he also describes a whirlwind, which spun him around and disoriented him. Consider the passage from the start of the second meditation, where the meditator reflects on her experience of radical doubt that concluded the previous meditation, the hyperbolic doubt at the end of the first. There she describes herself as feeling as if she fell into a deep whirlpool, which results in a feeling of disorientation. Of course, to establish that Descartes intended in the meditations to represent his own experience of divine inspiration would take substantially more argument, and our claim here is much more modest. Really, what we're trying to do is just say that there's reason to think that Descartes was both open to and familiar with the idea of mystical experience, and that his own experiences with purportedly prophetic dreams had a lasting impact on him. Okay. Now, the question remains, what exactly was his experience with the so-called meditative genres in the Christian tradition? It's surprising that despite noticing connections between Descartes and Bérulle, much of the work tying Descartes to Augustine, Teresa, de Sales, and others remains pretty speculative. Scholars focus on Descartes' Jesuit training, suggesting that he would have been exposed to them at the time, and that he would have had access to a variety of meditational sources. Others suggest that given the relative importance and visibility of figures, meditative figures, Teresa and de Sales, in 17th century France, there's a good chance he would have at least been exposed to their writings. The trouble, of course, is that Descartes rarely cited anyone, and by his own admission, was loath to read anything very long. You can see a letter to Mersenne in 1640 where he says as much. Moreover, in communal religious contexts, many ideas from the mystagogical traditions that may have influenced Descartes may have been transmitted orally as opposed to in some sort of written form. Yet, there does remain direct evidence of the influence that such thought could have had on him. Despite the well-known connection between Bérulle and Descartes, few have fully explored how intimately the two knew one another. The relationship between Descartes and Bérulle is by no means exhausted by their interaction at Chandos Salon. Remember, that was one of the other things we mentioned. Bérulle was the founder of the Parisian Oratory and was a statesman during the time Descartes studied at La Flèche. Hatfield notes that during Descartes' time at La Flèche, the Jesuits would hold annual spiritual retreats, which, quote, "The Augustinians of the oratory were fond," end quote. And Mersenne was certainly familiar with the Oratorians. In fact, he brought Descartes to meet with them regularly over the course of a couple of years in the 1620s. This is likely the time during which he met various members of the oratory, including Bérulle. And during that time, we know that he struck up a close relationship with an important figure in the oratory, Gébieuf, as we'll discuss in a little bit more detail below. And I apologize about any sort of French pronunciation. I can read much better than I speak in French. So this series of meetings over the course of several years strikes us as particularly salient for a few reasons. First, following the Salon, Bérulle encouraged Descartes to pursue his philosophical project, a project which would ultimately lead to the abandoned Le Monde, the Discourse, and then ultimately the Meditations. It seems unlikely that Descartes would be so encouraged as to pursue such a large intellectual project were it not for a closer relationship than suggested by much of the literature. Additionally, during this period, Bérulle himself was working on a project in the contemplative tradition, The Life of Jesus, which represented a more meditative sequel to his not uncontroversial 1623 Discourse on the State and Greatness of Jesus. Now, this gives us good reason to think that Descartes would have been familiar with the contemplative tradition preached and exercised by Bérulle and the Oratorians. But another important, I think particularly important connection comes from Descartes' interaction in the form of the relationship he developed with Gébieuf. Gébieuf was a prominent figure in the oratory and maintained a relatively close intellectual relationship with Descartes throughout the course of Descartes' life. In fact, it was Gébieuf who would argue later, albeit unsuccessfully, for the inclusion of the Meditations as a textbook at the Sorbonne in 1641. During the time that Descartes was in Paris and visiting the Oratory House, it's worth noting, Gébieuf was working on a piece trying to reconcile human freedom with divine omnipotence on the liberty of God and creature. Descartes would later ask Mersenne for a published copy of that text, going on to cite the piece approvingly. Gébieuf's project was definitely not the same as Descartes'. Still, it should be noted that there appears to have been enough of an analogical relationship between the projects of the two men that it contributed to their friendship. There is, therefore, substantial evidence that Descartes was reasonably familiar with the Oratorians during the 1620s. This connection, we think, bolsters the claim that he would have been familiar with the contemplative traditions emphasized by the Oratorians. So let's turn to a discussion of Bérulle's spiritual background. And thereby trace the influences of various traditions from the late medieval and early modern Europe through the Oratorians and to Descartes. Okay, the Parisian oratory was itself guided by a blend of traditions that had become increasingly visible during the 16th and 17th centuries in France. The French school, as with many of its mystical precursors, brings together ideas from Neoplatonist and Christian traditions. Additionally important to our subject, however, is that Bérulle himself was directly and substantially influenced by a number of other figures whom scholars have sought to tie specifically to Descartes. For example, through his connection to Madame Acquerie and her spiritual circle, the Acquerie Circle, which included a number of prominent figures in France, Bérulle would have access to and come to internalize a number of different styles within the mystagogical literature. The Acquerie Circle provides us the most direct connections between Bérulle and a number of other traditions, including that of Teresa of Avila. Acquerie's own purported visions of Teresa of Avila in 1601 and 1602 had convinced her that she should pursue the founding of a reformed Teresian Carmelite order in Paris. And aided by Bérulle, de Sales, and a few others, she was able to do so in 1604. In fact, Bérulle himself was awarded superiorship over the Carmelite nuns upon their arrival in Paris, and he handpicked the nuns who would eventually move from Spain to France, insisting that only the most exemplary of the order should be allowed to found the French group. Bérulle himself undertook at least 2 pilgrimages to St. Teresa's tomb, evidently seeking permission for relocating her order. The connection between Beyrul and Teresa provides further evidence for Christie and Mercer's position that Descartes would have been familiar with Teresian mystical theology. Given the tight connections between Beyrul himself and the Reformed Carmelite order's founding in Paris, the tradition was almost sure to make its way to Descartes. Teresian meditation, however, was by no means the only style of mystagogical thought present in the Ackery Circle. For example, John Cruikshank notes that the Ackery Circle's new religious enthusiasm was not only informed by 16th century Spanish mysticism, but by earlier mystical traditions of the Low Countries and the Rhineland region. These were likely introduced by Benet of Canfield in particular, and Dom Beaucousin. While Beaucousin appears to have introduced the Ackery Circle to the Rheno-Flemish tradition of such figures as Toller, Ruysbroek, and Harphius, it's Benet's own work, The Rule of Perfection, that we find the most direct influence of these traditions. Charles Williams describes the Rule of Perfection as having clear ties to St. Bonaventure, the Pseudo-Toller, Ruysbroek, and the anonymously penned Theologia Germanica. The influence of Benet's Rule of Perfection on the Ackery Circle and Beyrul in particular is really noteworthy. A manuscript of that text was circulating in and being used as a meditative device by the Ackery Circle as early as 1593. There are a number of themes present in that specific text that ultimately find home in Cartesian thought as well. Themes such as a strict adherence to the doctrine of divine simplicity, yet one which still places a primacy on the divine will, the freedom of the will as alignment with the divine will, the purging of images from the intellect during the meditative process. All of these make a prominent showing in both Benet's work and in the Meditations, Descartes' Meditations specifically. Given this conceptual overlap and the close connection between Descartes and the Oratory, there's reason to think that Descartes would have been at least familiar with the style, genre, and approach to mystagogical theology of the Rheno-Flemish tradition. Now, we've introduced a number of threads which seem to be tied together in the thought, writing, and political exercises of Cardinal Beyrul. It's clear that Beyrul was not only familiar with, but particularly fond of Teresa's works and found them to be of special importance, so much so that he wanted to introduce her to the French spiritual scene. Rather than merely adopting the teachings of Saint Teresa, however, Beyrul worked to blend her thought with his own background in the Rheno-Flemish tradition. Through the Ackery Circle, Beyrul was exposed to and worked with figures from a number of different orders in the French Catholic scene. It's through Beyrul's oratory that we find connections to the thinkers that folks like Christie and Mercer, Bradley Rubridge, and Wilson Undercuffler have suggested might have influenced Descartes. Beyrul and the Oratorians provide us a link to the variety of traditions and the blending into a uniquely French form of what Beyrul called an everyday mysticism, which incorporated aspects of a variety of different sources. That Descartes spent several years with the Oratorians shortly after having had, by his own account, a mystical experience is noteworthy, given Beyrul's own experience addressing the putatively mystical experiences through Madame Ackery's ecstatic visions. All of these themes converge in Descartes' Paris years, and this suggests that his access to various mystagogical traditions extends well beyond just the Jesuit curriculum taught in the 17th century. As we've seen, Descartes' intellectual context was imbued with mystical thought. The figures with whom he interacted were themselves steeped in various mystagogical traditions and figured prominently in both intellectual and political scenes. Moreover, Beyrul encouraged Descartes to pursue his philosophical and scientific program. Such an encouragement, however, may have carried more weight than scholars have recognized or perhaps admitted, if we're feeling spicy. And since we're dropping hot takes, we probably should. First, citing Adrien Baillet, Zeno Wendler suggests a different interpretation of that interaction between Descartes and Beyrul, that is, at the Salon. Wendler notes that as the highest officials in the Catholic Church, cardinals, quote, have jurisdiction over the spiritual life of any faithful seeking their guidance, such that Beyrul had the power to impose an obligation of conscience upon Descartes in the name of God, end quote. He goes so far as to suggest that this is precisely what Beyrul did, quote, adding the warning of divine displeasure should Descartes disobey, end quote. Pretty compelling. Additionally, there's a tendency among contemporary scholars to understand Beyrul's encouragement as both grounded largely or entirely in science. It was, after all, the scientific method that Descartes seemed to have been criticizing at Islam. However, as Stephen Gaukroger notes, quote, natural philosophy was charged with theological and metaphysical questions for Beyrul. And one of Descartes' first tasks on arriving in the Netherlands was to work on a metaphysical and theological set of questions, end quote. So the anachronistically non-theistic scientific focus of contemporary scholarship once again problematically narrows our focus. If indeed Cardinal Beyrul's encouragement was more of a divine command to pursue a scientific, metaphysical, and theological project, then we should not be surprised to see Descartes produce a meditational text grounded squarely in mystagogical traditions from which the order originated. There is still a question, however, regarding Descartes' use of the particular genre. Mercer has argued that Descartes owes a debt to Teresa, among others, and Underkuffler suggests it's the Sales and the Augustinian tradition that's much more operative in the Meditations. Our view is closer to that, as we said before, of Rorty and Cunning. We maintain that Descartes pulled aspects from a wide variety of traditions in order to impact the widest audience possible. As Cunning puts it, quote, most obviously, different intellects will have different commitments. Some of the individuals working through the Meditations will be Aristotelians. Some will be mechanists. Some will be theists. Some will be atheists. Some will not yet have an articulated view of reality at all. Descartes will write the first-person Meditations so that it is sensitive to the different commitments of the spectrum of unamended intellects, so that as many of us as possible will be able to reason from and through our past commitments in the direction of a paradigm that is new, end quote. It's well known that Descartes wrote in a number of different styles throughout his life. In addition to the Meditations, we see a more traditional textbook in the Principles modeled after late scholastic texts, scientific and physiological treatises in Le Monde and Loam, among others, and the autobiographical discourse on method. During his time at La Flèche, Descartes studied rhetoric intensely. Additionally, he was very close friends with and admired the rhetorical style of the French stylist Balzac. In particular, Descartes seemed to appreciate of Balzac's writing, and this is a quote, a rejection of arid styles, a rejection of forms of eloquence that conceal the absence of arguments, and above all, the priority of persuasion over style. On closer examination, then, Descartes is not so much concerned to defend traditional rhetoric as to identify those features he finds valuable, and these are those which induce a heightened attentiveness on the part of the hearers or readers, with the result that they're better able to grasp things clearly and distinctly, end quote. And that's from Gaukroger's Intellectual Biography. When we consider Descartes' consistently shifting style in light of his connections to Balzac and his intense study of rhetoric, it becomes clear that Descartes was not merely interested in presenting syllogisms to his interlocutors. He saw his project as reaching and persuading, through the use of clear and distinct perception, as many people as possible. Given his interest in style, persuasion, and casting a wide net, it would be unsurprising to find that there is no singular style that provides the influence on Descartes' approach to the Meditations. We've shown that he would have been familiar with a number of different styles, and given his stated interest in appealing to as many minds as possible, there's good reason to believe he would have blended mystagogical styles in his own work. At this point, I will turn things over to Amber.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Chris. So I'm going to take it over from here and talk just a little bit about, after a brief kind of excursus on Descartes' motivations, I'm going to talk about what we actually mean by the term mystagogical a little bit, and what kind of literature counts as mystagogical, as well as the kind of spiritual itinerary that this kind of literature tends to set out. And then we're going to dive in to the meditations a little bit, and have a look at how some of this plays out in the meditations themselves. Can everyone hear me okay? Are we all right with audio? Good, great. So next slide, please, Chris. Okay, so I think Chris has given us good reason to think that Descartes was familiar with various strands of what we are calling mystagogical literature, and that he employed it in order to reach a wide readership. But as to kind of Descartes' other projects or intentions in the meditations, the parallels that we're going to draw here make no strong claims about Descartes' more specific motivations and intentions in the meditations. So our view is compatible with both what we might call like religious Rene, so kind of pious Catholic Descartes, who has mystical experiences and who's like sincerely trying to demonstrate how the theological aims of medieval spiritual literature could be reconciled with more modern scientific and mechanistic approaches. As well as with a more kind of revolutionary Rene, who is sort of slyly turning Christian contemplation on its head by pushing his radical new philosophical agenda, Rene the activist, pushing his new philosophical agenda within the confines of this already kind of familiar textual tradition. It's also possible that Descartes himself had mixed motivations for employing the genre as he does, so like we don't need to ascribe any particular intention to him. The point here is just that our reading is compatible with all these different Descarteses. Okay. So whatever Descartes' intention regarding the use of the genre of medieval mystagogical literature, there's still some value, we think, in teasing out some of the continuities between the newer meditations and the older mystagogical traditions. For us, I mean, Chris and I are kind of part of this larger project of expanding the canon, pluralizing philosophy's history, and also kind of thinking about how this can be relevant for us in our in the way that we teach philosophy and the way that we propagate the canons that we've received. And so we think that the reading that we're going to propose, whether or not it's the most bestest accurate historical reading or not, I mean, I think it is, but even if you disagree, such a reading might be able to help reorient and transform us with respect to Descartes' thought in ways that we might not have expected, and thereby elicit a kind of transformation in how we approach the meditations in our own scholarship and in our teaching. Okay, so before we jump into the meditations themselves, it's probably helpful to talk a bit about our use of the term mystagogical. Ultimately, we mean it to kind of pick out the various strands of medieval contemplative, meditative, and devotional literature that today have come to be subsumed under the rather vague and not unproblematic notion or designation mystical. The term mystical is really tricky. It's not a term that these authors would have used to describe their own work in most cases. Descartes would have been unhappy to have his work characterized as mystical, most likely, given that in the early modern period it was used largely pejoratively to talk about false mystics, right, and heretics and witches and so on. And so the term carries a lot of conceptual baggage with it. And also today, the fact that contemporary scholars avoid applying it to figures like Descartes is probably an indication of the fact that mysticism is often associated with like the esoteric, the subjective, experiential, and the irrational, which obviously we want to avoid applying to our purportedly, rationalist philosophical heroes. In their own time, however, the texts that we're referring to as mystical, or in our case, mystagogical, were not commonly viewed as importantly distinct from systematic or speculative contemplative theological endeavors, even if they didn't really conform to the kind of strict disputational formats of the medieval scholastics. Still, since at least the 14th century, many mystagogical texts had, as would be the case with Descartes' Meditations as well, appeared in both the Latin and the vernacular. Sometimes they were written in the vernacular and translated into the Latin, as was the case with many women mystics. Sometimes they were written in Latin and then translated into the vernacular. But this suggests that they enjoyed a wide readership that included both literate laypersons and scholars. And so, this kind of notion of mysticism as being opposed to philosophy or being opposed to rational thought or contemplation as being anti-intellectual just doesn't track, historically speaking. But we choose the term mystagogical and not mystical for a couple of reasons. So first, to kind of point to the fact that unlike the way that it tends to be used in philosophy of religion today, mystical literature was not all about mystical experience, nor was mystical experience the sort of end-all be-all of the supposed spiritual journey. Moreover, the genres of literature to which we mean to refer were also not strictly divorced from the pastoral and devotional contexts in which they found their application. So our preferred term, mystagogical, points to kind of the fundamentally practical, pedagogical, and edificatory nature of these texts, which is an aspect often ignored by contemporary references to both mysticism and the meditative tradition. And we're going to come back to that later. So mystagogical literature, especially the meditative sort, puts forward a kind of spiritual itinerary that the meditator is supposed to follow. And this is just a picture of Christus und die minnende Seele, or Christ and the Loving Soul. It's a German text that I've worked on that was popular in the 13th to 15th century. And here you have the kind of mystical stages being represented. I don't know if you can see it or not, but it's a pretty crazy text. Anyway, and texts like these put forward a kind of spiritual itinerary that the meditator is supposed to follow. Now, a lot of contemporary literature on Christian Neoplatonist mysticism and a lot of the literature that actually analyzes Descartes' connection to the historical meditative traditions tends to cash this spiritual itinerary out in terms of a three-stage path. Basically, it follows the via purgativa, so the purgative or purification stage, the via illuminativa, the illuminative stage, and the via unitiva, or union with God stage, which sometimes gets cashed out instead as contemplation of God, or the via contemplativa. Now, obviously Christian writers like to have things in Trinitarian sounding threes. And in the paper, I had a Monty Python reference to, 1, 2, 5 here. But, Christians like to have things in threes. Sounds Trinitarian. It's cool. The threefold path was also well established in Christian devotional literature during Descartes' time. But although it can provide some guidance with respect to reading Descartes' Meditations in light of Christian meditative genres, this reading also remains somewhat limited from a mystagogical standpoint. So first, the overemphasis on the three-stage journey has led a lot of commentators to more or less restrict their comparison between Descartes' Meditations and earlier meditative traditions to the first 3 or 4 meditations. So you get to purgation, and then you get some, illumination by the natural light, and then you get a proof of the existence of God, and everything else is just gravy. Everything else is just kind of added on. And we want to resist that reading. It ignores the fact that Descartes explicitly divides the meditations into 6 metaphorical days that he thinks each of which require individual extended attention. Second, many of the authors of medieval mystagogical literature themselves don't use a tripartite schemata. They don't divide their text into three. They have 7 stages or 15 stages or 2 stages or whatever. They often also frequently speak of the journey as containing stages that don't correspond to, like, purgation, illumination, union. So it just isn't the case that the tripartite way is always the way that we have to interpret any kind of mystical or mystagogical text. Plus, no matter how many stages it's taken to encompass, the spiritual itinerary is seldom thought by its authors to be a linear process. So it's not like you have purgation and then comes illumination and then comes union and contemplation and then you're done, right? There can be significant overlap between the stages. Very often, the progress of the spiritual wayfarer is characterized by significant relapses or sudden spurts forward, by fleeting moments of unitive or ecstatic rapture, followed by dark nights of the soul and feelings of abandonment and regress. Even if experiential or contemplative union with God is considered kind of the proverbial climax of the spiritual journey, and even if it is taken to be best reached via some sort of like subjective purification and divine illumination, for many mystagogical authors, and this is really key for our point, the unitive stage is not the end of the journey. So basically, as long as human beings remain essentially embodied social creatures, the individual who has managed to become united with God in contemplation nevertheless always returns to the world a transformed creature, one whose view of the world has also changed, and who in turn seeks to further reform the world in light of the insights that they have won and in consonance with the divine will. And this is significant because it underscores the fundamentally practical, moral, and social implications of the soul's journey. So the path of spiritual growth is not merely, or even sometimes primarily, intellectual. It's as much a matter of the subject's volitional orientation as it is their cognitive attunement. And we think that this is important for interpreting Descartes as well. Okay, so we think there's a better way to approach the structure of the meditations than merely kind of focusing on purgation, illumination, and union at the expense of the other aspects of the mystagogical genres. We think that focusing a little bit more on the dynamic notions of turning and transformation is more helpful. And these are actually terms that medieval authors are using themselves. So the notion of turning has obvious roots, say, in like Plato's allegory of the cave, but it's also super prominent in Augustine and many later Christian mystagogical texts that take up aspects of the Neoplatonist and Augustinian traditions. Importantly, though, the Platonic metaphors of the soul and the idea of the souls being turned and stuff, whether we're speaking of reorientation or reformation, they're not first and foremost about religious or mystical experience. They're about education, right? And especially in Augustine's hands, this educational aspect isn't purely epistemic, but also fundamentally involves the will. So the dynamic movement of turning and being turned, which gets really essentially tied up to questions of activity and passivity in these texts, also get linked to Christian ideas about sin, error, grace, and freedom. And we see little hints of these here and there throughout the meditations, I think. In high to late medieval mystagogical texts, especially those found in the Rheno-Flemish tradition, the Augustinian metaphor of turning takes on even more significance. I've done some work on that, on the idea of kehren and kehr in Middle High German mystical literature. It's also prominent in Teresa of Avila's work. So turning is no longer just one stage among 3 or many. It's like the fundamental movement that characterizes the dynamism of spiritual progress and the pursuit of wisdom in conformance with the divine will. So it involves a kind of complicated dance of receptivity and activity on the part of the mediating subject. And it's a dance that's not completed upon just having arrived at divine illumination or union. The soul has to return to the world and engage with it as a transformed being who is ever aware of her dependence on the divine will, but is nevertheless in a new position now, of genuine intellectual and volitional autonomy in alignment or attunement with that divine will. The word autonomy here is a little anachronistic, I know, but I think it does kind of capture what's going on in these texts. So, okay, I think when we turn our attention to the metaphors of turning and transformation, we can identify in the meditations various mystagogical movements that the meditator has to make that correspond to different kinds of transformation that we find in the meditator. So let's kind of walk briefly through the meditations and see if we can't point out a few of these movements and transformations that the meditator is called upon to undertake and to undergo that have parallels in the medieval literature. So the first meditation opens with the meditator becoming aware of the radical error in which she has found herself and the need to demolish everything completely and start again right from the foundations. Now, this isn't unusual for mystagogical texts. It represents the initial spark or moment of conversio, right, of conversion, the moment at which the soul is awakened from the comfort of their dogmatic or worldly slumber and thrown into confusion or spiritual turmoil. And in the Christ in the Loving Soul image that I had up a few slides ago, you actually see Jesus waking the bride, who is the soul, while she's like laying comfy in bed, and he's waking her up and saying, come on, you need to leave the world behind. Okay, so in these cases, the meditator, like many of the main figures in these kinds of texts, feels overwhelmed by the task at hand and admits that she must reach a certain level of maturity, spiritual maturity, before she can even begin to pursue such a monumental task. And in Descartes' meditation, she then lays out the method of doubt by which she's going to accomplish this demolition, which the reader is implicitly encouraged, of course, to emulate, because the audience of this, I mean, we tend to talk about what the meditator is doing, but really this is all for the reader who's being directed by the meditator. Now, the movement emphasized in the rest of the first meditation is indeed one that involves kind of the traditional sense of this traditional purgative move of turning away from the world of the body and sensation, of false images and illusions, a movement that serves to detach, unmake, de-image, or unform the soul from its customary attachments to false images that can deceive the intellect and distract the will. So in Eckhart, this would be something like Abgeschiedenheit oder Abgescheidenheit, Entbilden, and so on. Now, to be sure, the meditator spends most of the first meditation imaginatively turning the reader away from the material world by considering the various possibilities, right, of madness, mental illness, dreams and hallucinations, a deceptive god, and an evil demon. Yet importantly, this isn't a mere call to purgation. It's also a call for the cultivation of discernment. And this was a topic, the idea of spiritual discernment was a topic that had by Descartes' time become especially pressing in the mystagogical literature, given the rise in power of the Catholic Inquisition and growing skepticism among church authorities about bodily and sensory religious experience, not seldomly the experiences of women mystics. And it's actually here that Descartes perhaps owes his greatest debt, I think, to 16th and 17th century women mystics who had developed considered responses to the various often heavily gendered treatises on the discernment of spirits, which, inspired by French theologian Jean Garson's early 15th century tracts on the subject, often specifically called the veridicality of women's religious experience into question. So for prominent women like Teresa and Avila, and later for Madame Acari, who was considered an expert in spiritual discernment amongst the oratorians and in the Parisian circles that she circulated in, Much of their recognition and acceptance as both intellectuals and as spiritual or theological authorities depended on their ability to provide evidence for the veracity of the mystical experiences that they claimed to be the sources of their insight. So both Teresa and Akari thus developed careful and elaborate criteria for discerning genuine divinely inspired religious experiences from those caused by mental illness, hallucination, or demonic sources, thereby, in essence, introducing sophisticated evidential considerations into religious epistemology and founding a theological tradition from which Descartes could take inspiration for his method of doubt. So such theologies of discernment, as well as the skeptical treatises like Gerson's treatise that instigated the development of these theologies of discernment, provided a wealth of material from which Descartes could draw inspiration when it came to strategies for unforming his own meditator and providing her with a provisional method for discerning truth from error. And this method of discernment represents the fundamental skill that the meditator is asked time and again to actively cultivate throughout the early meditations. And as in many mystagogical texts, this creates a tension between activity and passivity, productivity and receptivity that's going to end up driving personal transformation. Okay, so the tension between activity and passivity is on full display in the transition from the first to the second meditation. Despite the claim that there's no external action involved that could present a bodily danger to the meditator, so Descartes' meditator is in a much more privileged position than, say, somebody like Teresa or Madame Akari. Still, the end of the first meditation indicates the arduousness of the journey that lies before the meditator and the laboriousness of the task that will be required. The language here really indicates that the impediment to progress is not merely one of ignorance, but also and perhaps even primarily of the will. So the meditator must make an effort to remember the shakiness of what used to seem firm, to resist falling back into habit and custom, and to, quote, turn my will in completely the opposite direction, end quote. Not only must she stubbornly and firmly persist and do what little is in her power, she must also be prepared to toil in the inextricable darkness in which she finds herself upon turning away from the senses and becoming unformed through the act of doubting. That is, as with the spiritual exercises proffered in mystagogical texts, backsliding is assumed to be natural for the untrained mind. Full unformation thus requires sustained practice and effort. But of course, since every turning away is simultaneously a turning toward, the complementary passive movement to the soul's actively turning away from the world in such literature is it simultaneously being turned inward toward itself. When it ceases being deceived and distracted by the transient objects of the material world and the senses, the soul is finally able to clearly see its own nature, which in turn allows it to see reality in sharper relief. Indeed, in many mystagogical texts, divine illumination is not even possible if one does not first stand in the right epistemic and moral relations to both the external world and one's own self. So interestingly, like viewed in this light, although the cogito is generally taken to be like the moment in the meditations, and it's this kind of central moment, in light of Christian mystagogy, it's perhaps better understood as just kind of a moment of transition. The practiced and repeated efforts of the mind to turn itself away from the sensible enable a recognition of oneself essentially as a thinking thing, a mental being in action. And this in turn enables one to better judge the nature of reality, at least with some practice, as we see in the imaginative exercises of the ball of wax and the men crossing the square and so on. So the second meditation is really just a series of preparatory movements aimed at stripping away mere appearances and images from the things themselves taking the clothes off and considering them naked. And in all the sexy German mysticism that I encounter, nakedness and being naked is a huge theme, right? You got to get rid of, like, there's all these, souls dressed as women that need to take off their clothes and get naked. And Descartes uses the language of nakedness here, which prepares the meditator then to be properly turned towards God and informed by the grace of divine illumination, or in Descartes' case, the natural light. So illumination proper is largely a passive event, but it really only occurs in the third meditation. And so it's no accident that it's here that the language of the natural light becomes the most prominent. Prior to this meditation, the meditator was still kind of absorbed with thoughts of the external world and her own self. By the end of the second meditation, though, she comes to see things more clearly, but she's still kind of self-involved, right? She's not fully attuned towards what's higher and more perfect. So in order to be able to kind of fully understand the results of the sustained practice that the meditator has developed, she has to be turned towards God, which is a dynamic process that takes place over the course of the third meditation and involves her being illumined by the natural light. The meditator is now able to properly focus her attention on God for the first time and begin this movement from passive information to active contemplation. However, she importantly recognizes that as a finite being, she cannot achieve straightforward union in the sense of an intellectual theosis. So she can't grasp or touch in thought, as Descartes puts it, God. At least not yet at this stage. So it's enough that she just kind of understands by the illumination of the natural light. So what she learns in the third meditation is something that's emphasized over and over again in mystagogical texts, namely that the divine is somehow innate, internal to, or otherwise stamped upon the human being, and that the self one has better come to understand via this turn inward is something that both bears the mark of the divine and is wholly dependent on it. And this realization gives way to some of the most emotive and affective language in the meditations, right? So at the end, the meditator decides to pause and spend some time in contemplation of God, to gaze with wonder and adoration on the beauty of this immense light, and to experience for a while the greatest joy of which we're capable in life. And so in this sense, the causal argument in the third meditation shouldn't be viewed as careless or viciously circular. It's not like Descartes wasn't aware of these things. It's not supposed to be a decisive proof, but it's a means of helping the meditator adjust her kind of intellectual and spiritual lens and put her in a position to kind of enjoy a glimpse of the beatific vision in this life. All right. Moving on through the fourth meditation, which is where most commentators just kind of stop when it comes to connecting Descartes to the mystical literature. But here, I mean, we see a drastic change in the meditator. She's made real progress. She no longer has difficulty turning her mind away from imaginable things and towards things of which are, quote, objects of the intellect alone. She thinks she can see a way forward to knowledge of other things, right? Things are looking good. And yet, as with many mystagogical texts, especially in like Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross and the Spanish tradition, progress of this kind is often followed by a so-called dark night of the soul. So even though the soul is now properly turned towards God and has had this kind of fleeting experience of the beatific vision, her spiritual progress is followed by further doubt and the perception that like it's God who is turned away from the soul somehow. So Descartes' meditator too, like she can't remain in the state of contemplation. She has to turn back to herself. And she finds there a renewed sense of doubt, one that's kind of fundamentally tied to sin, error, and the nagging possibility that the God who is no longer immediately present could be a deceiver, right? So the worry is less what C.P. Raglan has called an antinomy of pure reason, this idea that like reason could show us that an omniperfect God both does and does not exist. It's more about the meditator's own dark night doubts concerning the reliability of her own intellectual faculties and the possibility that she might still be deceived. We might view this as her having received a new sense of epistemic humility. So she's become better in discernment, but now she realizes just how deep the problem of error really goes. And so she exercises various like theodical approaches. She gives various theodicies. Descartes kind of goes through the grab bag of theodicies, ultimately lands on something like a free will defense. But interestingly, it's the will here, not the intellect, that is suggested to be the way in which we most closely resemble God. But in contrast to a lot of contemporary free will defenses, of course, Descartes is no libertarian here. Genuine freedom on his view appears to not to require being able to do otherwise, nor does it even require feeling as though you have open alternatives. As long as you're properly turned towards the divine in contemplation, one could simply see what was true and good and should never have to deliberate, Descartes says, or the meditator says at least. So true freedom is that which is wholly aligned with that which is most autonomous and free, namely the divine will. The source of my error and sin, then, for Descartes, is a matter of self-deception. So it's a volitional problem stemming from the individual's inappropriate use of the will and failure to be aligned with divine purposes. So again, the fourth meditation kind of culminates by lauding the virtue of epistemic humility, this time regarding our ability to suspend judgment when we can't be sure that we're being appropriately illuminated by the natural or divine light. And so the meditator makes genuine epistemic and moral progress, replacing her kind of purgative method of doubt with the positive virtues of suspension and epistemic humility. And this kind of pulls her out of the dark night of epistemic and existential doubt that occasioned the need for theodicy in the first place. And so what this does is this sets her up for the ultimate act of contemplation in the fifth meditation, which will eventually prepare her for the return to the world, namely the ontological argument. Right. So now the meditator is not only able to simply kind of see the true and immutable natures of things by reflecting, and she can like turn her mental gaze to abstract qualities and categories like extension, motion, duration, right? There's callback to Plato's theory of recollection. Now she feels like she's just remembering them and not learning them. And then we get the ontological argument, right? And the meditator admits it has the prima facie appearance of being a sophism. But so long as she brings forth the idea of God from the treasure house of her mind, the ontological argument fully compels assent and cannot be thought otherwise. So there's still the possibility of backsliding and stuff, and that comes up again and again. But the meditator recognizes that she's made progress now. And that what she's achieved over the course of the 5 days remains kind of epistemically permissible, even if she's not always kind of thinking about all the things that she's learned. And this paves the way for the return to the world. So I'll try to be quick here, even though this is like our key point. We've said that one of the most commonly ignored aspects of mystagogical literature is its emphasis on transformation and the perfection of the human being, insofar as the individual continues to live in the world as an embodied creature. Now, obviously, the return to the world in Descartes' meditations looks quite different from the medieval approaches of like a Mechthild, an Eckhart, or a Julian of Norwich. But the sixth meditation is not just some sort of like weird addendum tacked on to the exercises of the previous 5. And we also don't think it's perplexing why Descartes undertakes an extended discussion of physiology here. The meditator is now in the right position to recover what she explicitly, through extended practice, turned away from in the first 2 meditations, to become re-imaged and reformed in light of both the certitude and the epistemic humility that she's now achieved. And now that she's recognized that God is not a deceiver, she has good reason to think that sensory ideas are not transmitted directly from God, like with the angels, the meditator can begin to trust her own nature. And she can read off of her own nature without fear of too much error, because her nature is now in conformance with the divine will. Right? And so her nature is free. She can read off her nature, and she is free to read off her nature as to the real nature of other things. But interestingly, at the end of the meditations, all of this that she's gotten back concludes with a reiteration of the meditator's newfound humility, despite the fact that that's not really an attribute we tend to ascribe to Descartes. The meditators got it. And it closes with an acknowledgement of our vulnerability to error and the weaknesses of our nature, which I think is really interesting. But really, ultimately, like if philosophia is ultimately the love and pursuit of wisdom, then the sixth meditation represents the culmination of the kinds of exercises that prepare an individual to move forward as a practical, epistemic, and moral agent in the world, and to practice science in the pursuit of true wisdom. And so this, we think, corresponds really well to Descartes' famous tree metaphor, where the whole of philosophy is like a tree, right? And the roots are metaphysics, the trunk is physics, and the branches emerging are all the other sciences, which can be reduced to medicine, mechanics, and morals, right? So the fruits of the tree come out in the practical life. And so in true mystagogical fashion, the meditations have led the meditator by the hand through the dark night of the intellect to a renewed and justified trust in her own nature as wholly dependent on the divine, with a newfound sense of freedom and genuine autonomy in conformance with the divine will. And now she's free to extend her branches to the applied sciences and to the good life, and is equipped with the tools to engage in these pursuits in ways that can themselves kind of reorient, revolutionize, and ultimately reform the modern world. So to conclude, we'll just leave this slide up there, but here's some virtues we think of our reading of the meditations. First, as we've noted, some interpretive problems disappear. Descartes doesn't abandon the meditative project halfway through. The Cartesian circle isn't really as scary or problematic as it seems to be, and so on. Our reading grounds the meditations in Descartes' own stated aims. So he states that he wants it to be used as a pedagogical tool at the Sorbonne. He also characterizes philosophy's general aim as ultimately practical, having fruits in medicine, mechanics, and morals. Our view makes sense of this. Another upshot is that just from a contemporary standpoint, it allows us to recover medieval mystagogical literature for philosophy and for philosophy teaching. And this also can then involve recovering a lot of the literature written by women during this time, which tends to go overlooked and ignored in the history of ideas. It ties Descartes' thoughts back to philosophy's Socratic roots, the importance of living well, and also brings out certain Platonic elements in Descartes that are interesting. And for me, at least, like it breaks down a lot of these artificial and really contingent divisions between late medieval and early modern philosophy. I tend to think there's a lot more continuity there than we tend to recognize. And so this helps us kind of show that the lines are a lot more blurry than we thought they were. So I will stop there, and thank you all for your attention. And I think we look forward to your comments and questions.
All right, big round of applause for Chris and Amber. We'll take about 4 or 5 minutes just to collect thoughts, let everything soak in a bit, go pee, go do whatever you need to do, and we'll come back in 4 or 5 minutes to start with Q&A. So, feel free to put your hand up to get in the queue as we go. I will call on people for Amber and Chris to sort of take turns or however they want to go. If you want to ask something in the chat, you're also welcome to do that. Cool. See y'all in a few minutes.
I'll just quickly say before we get started that if anybody needs it, you can raise your hand by going to the reactions button down on the bottom taskbar and clicking that, and then there's a raise hand button, and that'll put you a little hand up on the screen and put you in the queue.
All right, so we have Stephen up first, and if there's someone, one or the other, to whom you are addressing your question, you're welcome to point that out. Otherwise, you can just throw it out to both of them and see what they both have to say. Stephen, go ahead. Oh, no. Okay, we'll come back to you. David?
Sure. Hey, everybody. So that was great. Thanks, Amber and Chris. So much to think about, and you guys sure have done your legwork on so many related issues. So I was trying to think of what the most crisp way would be to put my question, and then I thought that it could be, how do you understand clear and distinct understanding? Do you see that as a mystagogical kind of achievement or process, or something that's, I don't want to use the word rationalistic, but it would be something like that. And I ask just because I think there's a couple different ways to tell some of the stories or give some of the accounts that you've given that are consistent, but where one of them doesn't emphasize the mystagogical stuff as much, but could still say this is a part of what Descartes is considering, right? He's got lots of tools up his sleeve. And one of the stories would just be that he thinks there's very little we can understand. Maybe, I think all he thinks we really can grasp in the meditations is that God exists and that our souls are not material. That's it. And maybe that's all he thinks we can grasp about anything with clarity, and then the rest is just probabilistic. Somebody could tell a story where they say that in the meditations, he's trying to do something very artificial and unnatural, right? Get the mind to detach from the senses for just a short time, a once in a lifetime, as he puts it, and arrive at a few truths. And then undergo a kind of transformation on the basis of a clear and distinct understanding of those truths. And then afterwards, go back to a life immersed in the imagination and the senses. He says that in a couple letters. He says, do philosophy 2 hours of imagination. And so the question I had about clear and distinct understanding is just, somebody could tell a story where we still have something like traditional rationalist understanding for Descartes, but just a small amount of it. And then we're embodied and we're not the traditional rationalist kind of figure. But we're also not being especially mystical for any high percentage of time either. So please just address my question wherever you see fit. Thank you.
Chris, you want to have a go at this? I mean, I have something I could say, but I'd like to hear your take on clear and distinct perception first. If that's cool.
Yeah, no, that's a really cool question. Yeah, thank you, David. So, yeah, I mean, I think I'm inclined to go the route that you suggest, where what we clearly and distinctly perceive is pretty minimal and it's pretty rare. I mean, I think it's hard to deny that he thinks that we can have some sort of clear and distinct understanding of the divine nature. And then, I think we have a clear and distinct perception of our own essence, and maybe a clear and distinct perception of the nature of physical body. But beyond, and that is in a lot of ways fairly rationalist. And I think this is part of the thing that I want to be careful about in saying that he's not really a rationalist, is just that, depending on to what extent we think he's actually committed to the kind of mystical stuff, which, apologies, Amber, I know we want to avoid that term, but depending on to what extent we think he's actually committed to the mystical stuff, and it's not just a stylistic choice, I don't think that's inconsistent with reason. In fact, like Benet of Canfield says things like, we ought to work our way through causal and ontological arguments as preparation for some sort of mystical union with God. So I guess to try to answer your question, how we understand clear distinct perception, I think it's primarily intellectual, possibly occasionally mystical in some sort of robust sense, but incredibly limited. And I think you're exactly right to say most of the time we're actually just engaged in probabilistic reasoning. We're engaged in sort of imaginative experience, in the sort of sensory notion. Amber, do you want to add on?
Yeah, I mean, what I want to say here is that this again points to the problems, I think, with both the terms mystical and rationalist, which first of all tend to get set up as like opposing each other in some sense, which historically they just don't. At least if we understand rational in this kind of broad sense that one can be rational and be engaged in the kinds of activities that get subsumed under the label mystical. Probably, if you mean it in this kind of stronger sense, then we need to kind of cash out what that sense actually is and whether it refers to anything helpful. But I really don't like the term mystical and mysticism because it's just so wishy-washy. Even mystagogical is a little like, we use it here because I think it's helpful for our purposes, but like Christina Van Dyke has talked about, she prefers to use contemplative these days instead of mystical. I resist contemplative as a blanket term because I think it's too intellectual sounding. And I think it doesn't bring in enough of the affective side necessarily. But I'm at a loss for what the appropriate word is. The problem is when we tend to think about like the mystical, we tend to think of William James' characterization of mystical experience, and that's not what these texts are about. That's not what these texts are even necessarily aiming at. I mean, the thing that James talks about with mystical experience is often the inciting event for a mystical treatise, as opposed to what's kind of aimed at. That being said, a lot of those texts that we do talk about, that we do kind of lump under the rubric of mysticism, do focus on the metaphor of vision, which you have with clear and distinct perception, I think. So, you do have the parallel to that literature, just in terms of style, right? And the metaphors that are used. And I would be okay, I think, with saying something like Descartes' understanding of clear and distinct perception is something like akin to what we might call a kind of mystical vision, something that's had fairly rarely. It takes a lot of practice. You come back from it and you aren't always in it all the time, or something like that. Like, I would be okay with that kind of approach. But I don't know if the text all bears that out or not.
I mean, it's definitely not, I think, implausible. There are later Cartesians, Malebranche among them, who kind of pushed the theory of vision in God, where when we have these kind of abstract ideas, perceptions, clear and distinct perceptions of, say, the nature of a triangle or something, what we're actually getting at is God's idea of that thing, as opposed to our own. So there's some sort of interface. And so I think, I don't think that's Descartes' view. I don't think that it's necessarily far removed from Descartes' view. So depending on how strongly we want to push that route, I think there's at least historical parallels that show up shortly after.
All right, should we keep going? It looked like, Stephen, your audio is working now. So
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes.
Sweet. Okay. So Chris and Amber, thank you so much for the great talk. I learned a lot. That's always the indicium of a good talk in my book. So thank you so much. I was wondering how your reading interfaces with what goes on in the objections and replies. So you've laid out a pretty convincing case that there are very strong parallels between the mystagogical tradition, as you put it, and the meditations. So I'm fairly convinced of that. What I'm less convinced of, given what goes on in the objections and replies, is that this actually represents, or at least some of the moving parts of the reading you've given match up super well with Descartes' stated positions in the objections and replies. So like he talks about following the order of geometrical demonstration, and that's why the sixth meditation has to come at the end, right? It's not about returning to your body at the end of a mystical experience. It's about this thing about geometrical order. Now, it could be both, obviously. So this is one way into that. But then another point is, the guys he's talking with in the objections and replies were pretty learned guys, right? So it's like Hobbes, Gassendi, Arnaud, all these pretty well-read people. And at least to my recollection, though, of course, this could be faulty, and feel free to correct me on this if I'm wrong, because obviously you've done much more recent thinking on this than I have. None of them seem to pick up on this mystical connection. I know Arnaud calls him out for cribbing Augustine's argument for the cogito in, I think it's the fourth set of objections. But yeah, so I guess if you could just speak to those, to that sort of grab bag of concerns about what goes on in the interaction between your reading and the stuff in the objections and replies.
Yeah, I mean, I thought a little bit about this because I was also thinking like, okay, well, the tone in the objection and replies is much different than the tone in the meditation. And so there is this question of, you know, you have these interrogators, which of course, and these get published with the meditations, right? So, you know, it's not like these are coming out after the fact or are ad hoc or anything like that, right? But and I was thinking about, okay, so how do we reconcile some of these answers that are given? One possibility is really just, you know, like I said in the first slide that I presented, you know, our interpretation is compatible with lots of different Descartes and different kinds of motivations and so on. And when he's responding to the objections, which he wants included because they give him intellectual street cred, you know, he's going to respond differently than his meditator might if being guided through the meditations. You know what I mean? I mean, so this is like Descartes responding to objections, whereas you have the meditator who's being guided along in a certain way. And that those things might not be as kind of antithetical as we might think. Why the objectors aren't like objecting more to the mystical aspects, or
not objecting,
whatever.
but just picking up on it. Yeah.
Yeah. It might, I mean, it might just be in terms of what those dudes were discussing at the time, like what they were concerned with. You know, they're not concerned with it. They might have found it a little bit weird that he was doing meditations, or they found it so banal that it wasn't even worth mentioning because it was so commonly known what this genre was up to. Either one of those, I think, is a plausible explanation. But I do agree. I think there's a little bit of tension in tone, and that's something that we have to work to talk about a little bit more, maybe.
Right. Like another example would be, I think he acknowledges that there's a supposed problem of the Cartesian circle and he gives a response to it, right? Whereas on your reading, maybe this doesn't arise because this isn't meant to be a strict demonstration. So the fact that he appeals to clear and distinct ideas and proving the existence of God before proving the truth of the truth rule doesn't necessarily matter, right? So maybe and again, this could be made totally compatible. I'm not at all saying I like this reading a lot. I like the attention to genre, super good. Just sort of pointing at these different places where maybe some of the moving parts need to be polished. I don't know. That sounds mean. I'm not trying to be mean. I'm sorry.
No, it's a totally fair point. And honestly, like a few minutes into talking myself, I thought, oh yeah, this question's coming up. I know this is coming. It seems like exactly the right question to ask. I mean, regarding a couple of the specifics, I think Amber is exactly right. I mean, Gassendi at least seemed really not terribly concerned with style so much as just that, a disembodied mind is insane or something like that. That very concept is incoherent. And so it would be unsurprising that he would gloss style to try to dunk on Descartes on incoherence of his position. As far as the geometric thing goes, I mean, if I recall correctly, in the second meditations in the second replies, Descartes offers a geometric kind of reconstruction, and it's quite different from how the meditations actually runs. And so again, I think it kind of plays into that discussion of style. He's like, oh yeah, you want that? I can do that too. It's just that's not what I was doing here. And so I think there are maybe ways which would probably require a follow-up paper to kind of clarify why exactly it is that get you a guy that can do both. Awesome. Yeah, so I think it's going to require some finessing, and
well, it might be worth, I think about it now because like one of our main points is that the intention that we do want to ascribe to Descartes is that he wants to reach a wide audience, right? And like we all seem pretty convinced of that. And when we're doing public philosophy, for example, on Twitter or on a blog or something like that, we're going to write things differently than like I suck at philosophy Twitter. I'm bad at philosophy Twitter, but because condensing these things is really hard for me and making them sound cool and hip and using the lingo. God, I sound so old right now. But like, but then if somebody comes along and launches a devastating philosophical objection, obviously I'm going to respond in a somewhat different manner to them in writing than I would if I were just tweeting back or if we were exchanging things on a blog. And so we might think about it in that kind of way. And then like the idea of like, but let's publish it all together and then everybody can have a bit of what they want. So maybe that's one explanation for the difference in voice or the difference in tone.
Yeah, just one brief, tiny follow-up and then I'll shut up. But just to Chris's point about the sort of geometrical putting of the meditations, the second replies, yeah. If I recall correctly, I could be wrong about this, but I think the order is the same, but the method's different. So he says that he used the analytical method in the meditations. But anyway, that's just, again, I'm being nitpicky about this and stuff, so I'll shut up now.
No, that's great. I appreciate that. I'll have to take another look for sure.
It's awesome how many people are so knowledgeable about Descartes too. I forget that like, oh, people do this, like they go really hard into Descartes so they can just pull these things. So it's exciting. All right, Laura.
This was great. And it is sort of a blast from the past for me because I got both my undergraduate and graduate education with the Jesuits at Fordham. And the idea that the Meditations was not sort of a metaphysical demonstration ab ordine geometrico like Spinoza or Leibniz, that the Meditations really followed very closely on the pattern of Ignatius Loyola's spiritual exercises. So my first question is, since I didn't hear in your paper a reference to Ignatius's spiritual exercises, I'd like your take on that. But I mean, the Jesuits were quite clear that on the good side, for example, the Cartesian circle was sort of a non-starter because the cogito is a performance. It's not an inference. It is something that you sort of arrive at through a practical exercise, and it's not an inference from a first principle. That said, again, this is sort of my Jesuit background, Jesuit education coming home to roost. They didn't think that Descartes really followed through on that nicely. That he then drew a lot of inferences that according to his methodological scruples in the Discourse on Method, he was not permitted to do. Like, I think I am, therefore I'm a thinking thing. I guess the other side to my question is, the mystagogical traditions are varied. And I mean, again, one of the things the Jesuits are very clear about was that things changed rather drastically after Duns Scotus denied the idea of an analogy of being, or when you predicate being of finite things and God, you're using the same predicate. It's not analogous, it's not equivocal, it's univocal. And that would sort of change the whole idea of what you're meditating on. And I was just sort of wondering if that might sort of have put Descartes more on the side of the rationalists than your paper suggests. Again, I'm just sort of thinking, just speculating out loud. But I mean, when I think of mysticism, I think of, the whole apophatic tradition that, when you have a mystical experience or when you contemplate God, you're basically contemplating a negative. You're contemplating something that is not like anything that except maybe analogously, but even there, the whole idea of analogy is relativized. So I was just wondering, where Descartes would sort of fit into all of this. Like first, Ignatius's spiritual exercises. Second, whether he was consistent in this sort of, practical performative approach toward reaching philosophical truths as in addition to mystical union. And third, just exactly, what kind of God are we talking about here? Because if God is predicated univocally with creatures, if being is being, whether it's God or creatures, it's a very different conception of God than, say, you would find in Aquinas or the early Greek fathers. So yeah, I feel the Jesuits sort of like tapping me on the shoulder saying, good girl, you remembered this stuff. So I'll shut up now.
I mean, I could say with respect to the connection to the Ignatian tradition, I mean, there is literature out there on that, and there's this sort of what should be a fight, but it's really a non-fight in the literature about like, Descartes' meditations are Augustinian and not Ignatian, because Ignatian meditation relies more so heavily on the imagination and on imaginative identification and so on. And Descartes certainly doesn't want that. So they're more Augustinian. And then there's this other thing that's no, but they do follow Ignatius in this way. I actually think that they would be perfectly compatible with the kind of Ignatian imagination. I mean, I don't see that problem there. But what we do maintain in the paper is we're kind of more along the in line with Emily Rorty, who says that Descartes isn't really nailing himself down to one particular mystagogical tradition, but kind of just employing the genre in various ways that suit his purposes. And it may be because he has a certain style that he likes, but it could also be because, again, trying to appeal to a wide readership, like, you know, it's a grab bag of mystical literature, take what works for you. And given that mysticism can be both apophatic and cataphatic, you know, especially in the Reno-Flemish tradition. Well, okay, I shouldn't say that. Eckhart is very apophatic, but the women and Henry Suso are much more cataphatic in their mysticism. So drawing on that kind of, you know, drawing on Mechthild and Hadovik and those, that kind of tradition, that's something that still takes on this very affective cataphatic deal. I expect that his mysticism would be a little bit more tempered by a kind of intellectualism that would come out of more Jesuit modes of meditation. But it doesn't mean that that's all he's got at his disposal. With regard to the doctrine of univocity and Descartes' own view of God, I'm going to have to defer to Chris on this because I know he knows more about this than I do. But my inclination is to say that Descartes would not hold a strict doctrine of univocity. I don't know if he has a doctrine of analogy, but I do think he thinks that God and human beings are radically different to the point of like us not being able to successfully refer in some cases and so on. Is that right, Chris?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, as I see it, and there's a massive literature on this, and it's very complicated. But I mean, kind of the way I see Descartes' concept of God is much more in line with the kind of Platonist view of the one or the good or something along these lines, where we can kind of try to talk about God and we can say things of God. Such as God is not a deceiver. And the reason that we can say that is not, well, I mean, there's, I think, a complicated story about why we could say that. But we could say things like God is omnipotent, but given the sort of very strict commitment to divine simplicity, omnipotence just is the same thing as omniscience, as creation, as you know, God is purely active, there's no passivity, there's none of this sort of stuff. And so when we try to say something like, you know, God's will is X or something, we're also describing God's intellect and God's being and God's goodness. And so, you know, when we say it's a little bit artificial to say our will aligns with God's will, because it can't in a very real sense. And this is something that comes up over and over again, in particular with the will, where he'll say things like, you know, freedom for us is exactly the opposite of freedom for God. Freedom for God is the freedom from reasons. God doesn't have reasons, because if God had reasons, then there would have to be something else that's influencing or whatever. And whether we think that's a good argument is maybe a separate question. But you know, so freedom for us is not having possible options or possible ideas or being torn or feeling as if we have choices. It's just, you know, going with what we recognize as true. For God, it's exactly the opposite. And so, yeah, I don't think he's going to want to say that we have a very strong sense of univocal predication. I mean, I agree, Amber. I don't know that he has a consistent view about analogical predication either. He's cagey about so much stuff.
Yeah.
It's really hard to say exactly what the view is.
No, thank you. That answers a lot. Thank you.
All right, AG.
Cool. Thanks for this talk, folks. I'm I'm definitely not one of those people who knows a lot about Descartes. So you've given me quite a lot of things to think about with respect to this fellow. But so my question is about the category of mystagogy in general. I take it that you're talking about this as a practice that Descartes is engaged in, and presumably other people are engaged in as well. So I'm curious if you think this is like how unusual Descartes is even at the time. I'm thinking of other people like Pascal or other folks who might conceivably be kind of accused, credited, whatever you want to say, of doing a similar kind of thing. And I'm curious if you think that this is still like a project that could be ongoing, or if it is specifically linked to like the medieval modern connecting period in time, as poorly named as that is. Does that make sense, what I'm curious about?
I mean, for a while, I had totally thought that like I was going to write a new history of philosophy from the standpoint of mysticism, right? Like tracing the Neoplatonist line and not the Aristotelian line, and then kind of going that way. But I've come to find that the term mysticism, mystagogy, and so on it's anachronistic, it's highly problematic, and it tends to get, like you yourself said, should I use the word applied or accused or whatever. It gets a bad rap in philosophy, whatever it is. Basically, like if it's a way, it's to some extent a way of marginalizing a thinker, and it gets used pejoratively that way. But I mean, the notion of mysticism is kind of a 19th century invention. It has a history. The word has a history. It's a long and gendered history, interestingly. But like I mentioned, around Descartes' time, the word mystical. So you won't find the word mysticism very much at all. You'll find the term mystic and mystical to some extent, but usually it's in the context of decrying somebody as a false mystic. So it's this pejorative sense. But around this time, it's also becoming tied to claims of experience and ecstatic experience and so on. Earlier uses of mystical theology were hermeneutical. They were just used to refer to like being able to decipher the secret meanings of scripture or something like that. They get tied in the Middle Ages to experience via a lot of women writers. And so women start to, use the notion of experience to gain spiritual authority. And then you get this new notion of mystical that's now gender inclusive, but pejorative. And that persists for a long time until you get like 19th century German Protestant theologians and the American transcendentalists who make kind of mysticism and in effect the center of religion and the center of all that is good about religion and so on. You get this rehabilitation of the term to some extent, but in philosophy it's always remained kind of a bad word. You can't be a philosopher and a mystic to some extent, at least in the analytic tradition. And so I think, it can be the beginning of a larger project, but I think it also has to be a project that recontextualizes the notion of mysticism and really is clear about the fact that this term is not the most useful term that we have. And then we need to think about what terms we can actually use or reappropriate or coin. And I'm not sure how to do that. So my job is, like, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to take people who've been traditionally relegated to the static of mystic or texts that have been called mystical and to show how they're philosophically relevant. And instead of kind of the other way around. So, yeah.
All right, go back to David.
I only wanted to ask if no one else had another question, so I'm happy to step aside. But I wanted to mention one, Chris, on your comment about how divine omnipotence just is, divine substance just is, divine eternality and everything else. Richard Watson, I think you know this, he has this great paper, Descartes Knows Nothing. And that's the basic idea, it's right, is that if Descartes says God has feature X, and the only way to understand feature X is to say that it's the same as feature Y, and you only understand what be feature Y if it's feature Z, and then in the end, Z just is X again, right? Then you don't understand anything about God. And then he says the same applies pretty much to any substance and attribute that Descartes discusses. So that's probably helpful in terms of the larger thesis that both of you have, right? That Descartes thinks we know very little. I wanted to also comment briefly on Amber, what you had said about objections and replies in response to Stephen's really good question. Right, it is suspicious, right? The mysticism and mythology, it doesn't come up at all, right? So then the thought is, well, why not, if it's such a big thing? I guess one possibility, and it occurred to me when you mentioned public philosophy, actually, right? One possibility. This is unconfirmed. This is unfalsifiable in a way, but there's a way you could ground the interpretation. One possibility is that Descartes, talking to certain people, like you said, and if he brings up some stuff about mysticism to those folks, right, or they're not going to take it very seriously. But Descartes might have the view that there are these kind of mystical tools that you can use without identifying them as such, that are still very effective at helping to communicate with people. And the reason I thought of it when you mentioned public philosophy is just, there's a lot of people who think that public philosophy is not rigorous or important, right? They would and some people who think it is very important, and it is. But you can imagine going into a panel and trying to convince certain people of the importance of public philosophy by using the term public philosophy. But if you use that term, you might lose a lot of people in your audience right away because they think, well, what is this stuff? So you might lose other kinds of terms that are related to public philosophy, but they don't employ that language. So maybe Descartes just doesn't bring up the language of mysticism or mystagogy. I'm sorry, what's the other word?
Mystagogy, but that wouldn't have been in his, like, in circulation during his time.
Yeah. So maybe there just isn't. Maybe he's worried about using certain kinds of word. But I mean, it's unfalsifiable, the thesis, right? Then you say, well, he's thinking about it, but he doesn't use the word. But then what you would need to do is just all the stuff that you're already doing, which is locate other texts and other reasons for thinking that he takes all this mystical stuff seriously, and that he's using it as a tool, even if he doesn't use the language, which might make people run. Some people run.
It could, of course, go the other way too, which is that he's trying to do like radical new philosophy, and isn't using that language in the in the actual bulk of the meditations, but is using this more familiar genre, and then all the radical new stuff comes out in the objections and replies or something. So in one sense, I like your suggestion better, but it could easily go the other way as well.
Awesome. All right. So it looked like there was a big back and forth in the chat, but Carl is next, and then Audrey and Math.
Hey, thanks everyone. I'm going to do the totally that guy thing where I didn't hear the entire talk, but still ask a question. And it might just be David's question for a second time. But instead of going the public philosophy route, whatever public philosophy is, check out the hype in the chat for more of that. I was thinking maybe something like a spiritual exercises route. There's a whole, I think there's a project out of Notre Dame, but it's certainly not limited to them. There's a whole philosophy as a way of life inspired thing, drawing on the works of Pierre Hadot's book of that name and other such things. Special issue on teaching philosophy as a way of life in the American Association of Philosophy Teachers Studies in Pedagogy. Those are due in November. So you've got some time if you wanted to write about teaching Descartes along the lines that have been discussed today. I think that would be really fascinating, actually. So I guess to put the thing that might be a comment in the form of the question. What do you think about reading this as a set of exercises? I mean, I guess this is maybe also Laura's comment about Ignatius also. So I'm just going to lean into all of the question that's a comment tropes and stop talking now and see what you think about this.
Yeah, I'll jump in very briefly here. I mean, I think that is roughly kind of what we're suggesting. Descartes very clearly wanted this to be a textbook. He had, folks argue for its inclusion in the Sorbonne as a text. And so the idea is that it's exactly kind of a spiritual exercise, but maybe, I mean, again, I think we're agnostic, at least in this paper, with regard to whether it's spiritual or purely epistemic, or, exactly what the scope of that is. But yeah, he's definitely appropriating that style in an attempt to create some sort of kind of pedagogical project that will bring people into the sort of Cartesian program. Yeah.
The whole tree metaphor that we mentioned at the end, philosophy being like a tree, and the branches and the fruits of that are practical. I mean, so in that sense, I think we're right in line with what Descartes talks about in the Principles. And if we can see the meditations as belonging to part of that project as well, that's great,
Great, thank you.
Awesome.
So now math, is this the math question?
I'm sorry.
I'm afraid, I'm really
No, it's not. I mean, but
it's
actually good that Carl went first, because what I think struck me as so this was super fun, and it actually also felt really validating, because actually when I did some Descartes stuff in grad school, this is actually how I learned it. So I actually did learn it as a kind of thing that you ought to go through. Although, and purely anecdotally, because I TA'd for my grad advisor when he was teaching it this way, it turns out that if you're not kind of careful, you end up with some undergrads in a little bit of an existential crisis after you tell them that they should go through the first meditation as a spiritual exercise. We can talk about that over drinks later, but just be cautioned, okay? So yeah, I mean, I'm kind of channeling back, like okay, so I learned the meditations this way, but I also learned the meditations, and then maybe you could just tell me this is like purely idiosyncratic, but I also kind of learned that actually the star of the meditations is meditation 6, because it's all about getting us to this justification for mathematical knowledge. Right, so it's all about getting us to like certainty for why mathematics is a proper descriptor of the world, like for the world. And I mean, given that like most of how I know Descartes is through stuff in math, like that kind of was what has kind of sunk into my brain. But now I'm trying to think, like, what kind of cool ways does this make us think about relationships between certain kinds of practically oriented, maybe mystical thinking? Like he wouldn't be the only, he's like, he wouldn't be like the only one who's ever thought of mathematics in kind of mystical terms, definitely. But what kinds of like, I don't know. So maybe this is why it's half baked, right? But like now I'm trying to put those kinds of thoughts side by side, right? So taking seriously Descartes as a practicing mathematician, and also taking seriously Descartes as someone who is seriously engaged in the mystagogical tradition, and doing both of those things in exactly the same work, like what are you going to send the philosophers of, like, I don't have to worry about, I'm not a philosopher of math anymore. I don't have to worry about this. So like, what are you going to tell them they have to do now? This is very exciting.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't know, if you have this reading on which, that everything leads to math, as it were, I think that's consistent with the view that we presented. So that's cool. And also, like Cassie said, hashtag Pythagoreans for the win. But so that would be compatible with our views, that like you go through this mystical process, and at the end you get math. And you know, how exciting is that? But yeah, I mean, I think, you know, from the didactic standpoint, it does open the door for a lot of different kinds of ways of reading the upshot of the meditations, and things that you could do that could, I don't know, open new, I'm reading this thing of Descartes and drugs, new doors of perception, you know, for folk. I think what, for me at least, both in the US and in Germany, when the way that I was taught Descartes and the way that I saw Descartes being taught was just as this very, like, everything is about the intellect, everything is about the cognitive. The meditations are wholly epistemological, and epistemology is somehow divorced from the social and the political and the practical and so on. And I think that that way of reading the meditations is just a real bummer for people learning how to do philosophy. So being able to bring in these other elements, and then, you know, pairing Descartes with Teresa, or pairing Descartes with Ghazali, which I like to do a lot, is a lot of fun and makes people see connections that they might not have seen in other ways. And so for me, it's just, it opens up more kind of fun ways of teaching what philosophy can be.
Okay, so I know we have like 1 minute left, but I'm gonna drop a second wild hot take for which I will have no time to defend the actual position. So maybe unsurprisingly, I've been pretty influenced by David. And one of the things that David points out is that, as is probably true with a lot of kind of mystagogical literature, this isn't, despite what he says at the very beginning of the first meditation, this isn't a one-time thing, right? This is a practice. This is something we do over and over again. And the more that you do it, the better you get at it, the more sort of happening and the more refined your thinking becomes. And you might notice things on the second or third or 400th time working your way through the meditations that you didn't notice the first time. And I think one of the things that, again, I don't have time to fully defend this, but maybe over a beer afterward, is going on is that Descartes has built into the first meditation a defense of heliocentrism on the Cartesian physical account, which is predicated almost entirely on math. I think I have a tweet thread about this, but the short version is roughly the only way that you can deny sort of Cartesian heliocentrism, which is based on geometry and arithmetic and basic observation, is by thinking that God is a deceiver or that there's an evil genius who's deceiving you entirely. That is the only plausible way to undercut Cartesian physics. So I'll say I think that there's a lot of math happening there, and we can keep that going later. But I'm sure David's going to want to divorce himself from that reading entirely if possible. But
All right, awesome. I guess that brings us right to the hour. The chat is still blowing up, and that's fantastic. I don't know what plans are, but we can hang out if people want and still chat a bit more, or if you have other things to do, philosophical or otherwise, feel free to go off on your way. Thank you all so much for attending the third Cogtuito, yes, because it's Cogthreedo, third Cogtuito conference, and we look forward to, I hope, seeing you in August. Thank you all for coming, and thank you again to our speakers and for all of your fantastic questions.
Yeah, what Cassie said. Yeah, so I'll be here till at least 5 for people who want to hang out, and usually last few times we've hung out, well, 5 Pacific, we've hung out a bit after that anyway. So yeah, thanks again. Hope to see you soon.